Inside, they found the woman's body. She didn't remember how she died, but was sure Kim Jong-woo hadn't killed her, as he had always been kind to her. She hoped they could help find Kim Jong-woo. Otherwise, she couldn't leave. The bedroom wall was covered with photos taken at the columbarium, including Ji-hyun and Young-min's photos in the upper left corner. At that moment, they concluded that Kim Jong-woo was the murderer of Ji-hyun and Young-min's mother. Meanwhile, a police officer approached Ji-hyun's hospital bed. She was still alive. Suddenly, Ji-hyun's body exhibited strange symptoms and her soul sensed something wrong. Her image began flickering, terrifying her boyfriend, who thought she was ascending to heaven. Unbeknownst to them, a woman was lying in a hospital bed nearby, her body convulsing. Her father quickly called a doctor who stabilized her with a sedative. At the same time, Ji-hyun's soul returned to normal. Another spirit named Mi-gyong approached. She had been the lady of the room and was curious about the photos on the wall, which were evidence of Kim Jong-woo's murders. She had cleaned the day before her death and had never seen these photos before. She insisted they had nothing to do with Kim Jong-woo. As Young-min was about to call the police, a woman arrived, recognizing Young-min as she was the head nurse at the hospital. Curious about why Young-min was coming out of that room, she entered and found Mi-gyong's body on the floor. The police controlled the scene and took Young-min to the station as a suspect. Ji-hyun blamed herself for his plight, as he was only helping her investigate the murderer. Young-min reassured her not to worry, as he had done nothing, and the police would release him soon. He was happy to be with his beloved girlfriend. Ji-hyun thought he was joking, but Young-min seriously said, being with her, he wouldn't mind even going to hell. Ji-hyun laughed, agreeing without hesitation. During the interrogation, Young-min was assisted by Ji-hyun, a legal expert and detective, and he answered smoothly. He heard rumors of Kim Jong-woo assaulting someone at the hospital, which led him to suspect Kim as his mother's killer. Wanting to check Kim's house, he instead found Mi-gyong dead there. The police couldn't extract any useful clues and released Young-min the next day, after forensic results showed Mi-gyong had been dead for over a week, and Young-min's fingerprints were not on the syringe, clearing his suspicions. As he was leaving, a photo of Ji-hyun on the wall caught his eye. The obscured part was that of the previous officer. Ji-hyun broke down in tears. The woman lay comatose in the hospital, her soul wandering the earth, amnesiac, and now a mascot for a ghost taxi. The owner sought to help her regain as many memories as possible and found Ji-hyun's father, an officer who did not trust Young-min. Young-min, straightforward, revealed his mother had been a taxi driver, killed by a hit-and-run motorcycle on April 12th, the same day Ji-hyun died. To prove his connection to Ji-hyun, Young-min showed photos of Ji-hyun and his mother, feeling both cases were linked. Although the police focused on Kim Jong-woo as a suspect, Young-min felt something was amiss and stated he had no evidence yet, wanting to know more about Ji-hyun's death. The officer, blunt, said he couldn't trust Young-min yet and needed time to consider revealing the truth about his daughter being alive. Meanwhile, the police sensed something off as the evidence against Kim Jong-woo seemed too perfect and staged. Mi-gyong then insisted Kim Jong-woo was not the killer, urging Ji-hyun not to let emotions cloud her judgment, as sometimes those closest to us are the strangest. Even after her death, Mi-gyong defended Kim Jong-woo, whose injection technique clearly differed from the real culprits. Finding Kim Jong-woo was urgent to clear the confusion. Ji-hyun asked where he might be hiding, leading Mi-gyong to a secluded villa often visited by them and owned by the head nurse. Despite its remote location, the villa was valuable. Ji-hyun noted the head nurse must have a good background, but Mi-gyong revealed she grew up in an orphanage, hinting at secrets. The locked villa revealed nothing after a search by the two spirits, while Young-min waited outside. Mi-gyong cherished the place where Kim Jong-woo celebrated his birthday on the day of the hit-and-run. Caught off guard, they realized someone else was involved as a camera captured everything. At the hospital, Dr. Do Gyujin ominously watched his phone as the demented mother of a female driver, renowned for her filial piety on TV, woke up from a simple fall. Dr. Do Gyujin, with a sinister smile, considered murder after talking to the female driver about her mother's hospitalization for observation. Comforted by the driver, he resolved to kill. That night, dressed in leather, he ignored the head nurse's warnings. The next day, Young-min informed the police of his suspicions about the head nurse. Despite growing up in an orphanage, she owned a villa. She now lived in a rental apartment and resided on the same floor as Kim Jong-woo. The police concluded that Kim Jong-woo and the head nurse might be accomplices. At that moment, Young Min received a call. The female driver's demented mother had passed away. They immediately went to the funeral. There, Ji-hyun unexpectedly saw Dr. Do-gyu-jin's sinister smile. When he looked again, Dr. Do-gyu-jin appeared saddened. Meanwhile, to further investigate his daughter's death, the officer followed another officer to the detective's location. Their knocking went unanswered. Upon pushing the door open, they found the detective had already died. The murderer was none other than Dr. Do-gyu-jin. At the funeral of the demented woman, Kang Ji-hyun looked around and noticed that the aunt's spirit did not appear. They remarked on the strange circumstances of the aunt's death. She had accidentally fallen in the bathroom, suffered a concussion, but ultimately died of a myocardial infarction. Recalling Dr. Do-gyu-jin's eerie smirk, they felt something was amiss. As they left, they discovered the aunt's spirit sitting in the car. Rushing over, the aunt expressed a desire to see her daughter. Young Min brought the female driver to the car, telling her that her mother's spirit was there. The driver was skeptical and thought it was a tasteless joke. As she was about to leave, Young Min mentioned the song, "You Are My True Love," which the driver had sung solo at their high school reunion. Half believing, the driver wondered if her deceased mother was really there. The demented mother then mentioned that the driver had chosen her favorite song to perform, but had missed it due to work, causing days of silence between them. Just like before, the mother sat in the passenger seat of the taxi. Alzheimer's had robbed her of her memories, but her spiritual form remembered everything. Her daughter had tirelessly worked with her for many years. The mother said she was incredibly happy and made her final request, from now on, to live for herself and ensure her own happiness. The driver agreed, and during their last drive together, the mother's wish was fulfilled, and she joyfully disappeared. Upon returning home, they found Dr. Do-gyu-jin waiting with Grandma's blood pressure medication. Young Min was grateful, but Ji-hyun remained suspicious. Dr. Do-gyu-jin, emerging from the bathroom unnoticed, began searching for something. Ji-hyun saw him enter Young Min's room and followed. Young Min was drawn by her shouting. Confronted, Dr. Do-gyu-jin explained he entered because the door was open. His gaze kept returning to the charging cable on the desk. Seizing the moment, Young Min brought up his suspicions about the head nurse. Hearing Young Min had no evidence, Dr. Do-gyu-jin defended the head nurse as honest and kind, incapable of crime. After he left, Ji-hyun declared him suspicious. With no time for baseless guesses, they visited Kim Jong-woo's home again. Mi-gyung mentioned that Kim Jong-woo had panicked after seeing a sticky note and rushed out. Searching quickly, they found the note hidden in a stack of old newspapers. "If you need help, come to me." Just as they stepped out, the murderer of Kang Ji-hyun approached. Unaware of her identity at the moment, they were cautious. The murderer was about to leave when Young Min stopped her. The head nurse looked puzzled but invited him inside. Young Min asked about her relationship with Kim Jong-woo. Confused, she retorted that he was not a police officer and had no right to question her. Young Min was left speechless. As he was about to drink coffee, a memory flashed through Ji-hyun's mind. Young Min immediately put down the cup and left the room. The head nurse's face was expressionless, as she knew Young Min had grown suspicious of her and wanted to silence him. However, her plan failed. After leaving, Ji-hyun returned to the room because one's true nature is often revealed when alone. Indeed, the head nurse was anxiously looking at a keychain and a photo in her bag. Ji-hyun informed Young Min about this. At that moment, a detective called, reporting that another detective who had been taking photographs at the columbarium had died. Fortunately, they discovered a photo on the computer, the same one that was in the head nurse's bag, deepening their suspicion of her. To clarify the situation, Young Min approached Jo-ri, who immediately recognized the handwriting on a sticky note as the head nurse's. Young Min took a photo and warned Jo-ri to keep this to herself. Dr. Do-gyu-jin witnessed this scene and later asked Jo-ri about it, who gave a vague excuse. However, Dr. Do-gyu-jin sensed something was off and warned the head nurse to be careful. That evening, handwriting analysis confirmed that the handwriting on the sticky note matched the medical records. With the current evidence, the head nurse was the prime suspect. Just as they considered handing over the evidence to the police, Ji-hyun's image flickered but soon stabilized, making her feel like she was about to ascend. Taking a risk, Young Min confronted the head nurse with the sticky note, causing her to panic and admit it belonged to Kim Jong-woo, though she claimed he never came to see her. Young Min, skeptical, showed her the photo of the keychain identical to hers. Unfazed, the head nurse mentioned that all graduates from Daesun University's nursing school had such a keychain, rendering it inconclusive as evidence. Young Min gave her 2 days to reveal Kim Jong-woo's whereabouts, or he would go to the police. Unbeknownst to him, the head nurse harbored murderous intentions. As Young Min reached his doorstep, he was suddenly struck by a blunt object. In a dilapidated warehouse, Young Min regained consciousness due to Ji-hyun's calls. His body was firmly trapped, and nearby lay Kim Jong-woo, already dead. Dr. Do Gyujin approached, sitting across and mockingly laughing at Young Min, saying it was not his place to meddle. Otherwise, he'd lose his source of entertainment. Young Min was stunned as all truths were revealed. Earlier, after a dispute with his mother, Young Min had impulsively kicked a taxi and was distracted during class, planning to apologize to his mother, who had texted him to meet for dinner. His spirits lifted at the prospect of reconciliation. Meanwhile, his mother had taken Ji-hyun to a psychology exhibition, lending her a hair tie before leaving. Ji-hyun, investigating her friend's mysterious death at the hospital, approached the head nurse under the guise of discussing psychology. They drank merrily until the head nurse went to fetch more wine, giving Ji-hyun a chance to search for clues. Suddenly, there was noise outside, and a drug left her too weak to resist, barely managing to crawl outside. Dr. Do Gyujin approached with a sinister smile, taking out his phone to savor the moment. But Ji-hyun fought back, seizing the phone and striking it before running outside. Meanwhile, Mom is calling Young Min. There are no parking spots at the barbecue restaurant, so she has to wait for Young Min here. While talking, she suddenly spots Ji-hyun running towards her. She catches her just as Dr. Do Gyujin, smiling wickedly, appears. Sensing something is wrong, the woman helps Ji-hyun into the car. Just as she is about to drive away, a motorcycle crashes into her. Hearing the crash, Young Min realizes something is wrong and rushes to the scene. He sees his mother lying on the ground, her condition uncertain. Ji-hyun, unable to do anything, faints. Dr. Do Gyujin, seeing Ji-hyun unconscious, checks on the woman. The security guard arrives, and Dr. Do Gyujin pretends to help. As he is about to act, Young Min arrives. Dr. Do Gyujin introduces himself as a doctor. Seeing his mother's dire condition, Young Min decides to trust him. After some emergency aid, the ambulance finally arrives. Young Min tries to get on, but Dr. Do Gyujin pulls him off, saying there is no room and tells Young Min to take a taxi to the hospital. Dr. Do Gyujin then hurries off. At the taxi, Dr. Do Gyujin, unnoticed, injects a drug into the woman's body. Meanwhile, the head nurse drives off with Ji-hyun in Young Min's mom's taxi. Soon, a police officer finds Ji-hyun motionless on the ground. By the time Young Min reaches the hospital, his mother has passed away. To satisfy his perverse desires, Dr. Do Gyujin forces Young Min to watch a video of the murder. Ji-hyun loudly scolds him, but Dr. Do Gyujin doesn't see her. In their despair, Dr. Do Gyujin reveals his next plan. He intends to pin all the serial killings at Daesun Hospital on Kim Jong-woo and his wife Mi-gyong, aiming ultimately at Young Min. Kim Jong-woo brought Young Min here, and due to an accident, both were supposed to die here, making the plan seemingly perfect. Then, Dr. Do Gyujin ignites the gasoline on the ground, surrounding Young Min with fire. Ji-hyun, unable to physically interact, desperately throws herself towards Young Min. At that moment, her powers manifest, creating a barrier that the flames cannot penetrate. The police arrive in time and extinguish the fire, saving Young Min. He quickly tells the police the truth, all witnessed by Dr. Do Gyujin from a distance. Despite the unbelievable survival of Young Min, Dr. Do Gyujin decides to change his plans. Back home, Ji-hyun feels terribly guilty, believing she caused the death of Young Min's mom. After apologizing to Young Min, she retreats to her room, unsure of how to face him. Hearing her continuous crying, Young Min is heartbroken. Ji-hyun is also a victim and should not hide in self-blame. What's crucial now is to catch the murderer, a task too great for him alone. If Ji-hyun hadn't sacrificed herself, he would have been killed by the fire. This realization comforts Ji-hyun, and they decide to work together to catch the murderer. Meanwhile, the police have gathered information on Dr. Do Gyun. He has known the head nurse since the 6th grade when she was his grandfather's caregiver. They have been close for nearly 20 years, living together after his grandfather's death. Clearly accomplices. That night, the murderous duo meets outdoors, inadvertently admitting their guilt. Dr. Do Gyun decides to confront the situation directly, confident in his lack of evidence left behind. Everything is going as he planned. The police arrested him the next day. During the interrogation, he remained calm and composed. Even when Young Min confronted him face to face, Dr. Do Gyun admitted nothing. With no clear evidence, the police had to let him go. To expose the serial killer, Ji-hyun decided to fix her phone against Young Min's advice, as he had failed in his previous attempt. As the program ran, Ji-hyun's body started to turn transparent, prompting them to quickly ask the technician to stop. Helpless with the evidence so close, Ji-hyun decided to sacrifice herself for justice, which Young Min strongly disagreed with. Out of options, Young Min sought help from Hwa Gong-ja. After casting a spell, a general spirit possessed him and revealed that Ji-hyun controlled the realms of heaven and earth. Tampering with the phone would lead to Ji-hyun's real death, he warned, and then left the body. Confused, they wondered how Ji-hyun, already a ghost, could die again. Hwa Gong-ja, merely a medium for the general's words, suggested that meddling with the phone could bring great peril, possibly even the scattering of the soul. Meanwhile, the serial killer began a new plan by installing a camera in Young Min's car. Puzzled by his frequent hospital visits and his mutterings about finding his own murder evidence, and how he survived a fire, the head nurse shared this suspicion. That night, Dr. Do Gyun approached Young Min's car, unlocked it with a virus, and hid the camera. The next day, oblivious, Young Min and Ji-hyun got into the car. Dr. Do Gyun watched them talk, baffled. Young Min went to get a charger, remarking, "This is Ji-hyun's life." Mi Gayong appeared, asking them to take her to Kim Jong-woo. At the warehouse, Kim Jong-woo's spirit was indeed there, and the couple reunited as spirits. Young Min told him about Dr. Do Gyun's actions, blaming him for everything. Enraged, Kim Jong-woo turned into a vengeful spirit. Mi Gayong stopped him, not wanting her kind lover to kill or to part again. Her love calmed his vengeful spirit, and Young Min promised to make Dr. Do Gyun and the head nurse pay. Believing him, Kim Jong-woo revealed that he had recorded the head nurse's crime and sent it to his grandmother. After thanking them, Mi Gayong and her lover ascended to heaven, hand in hand. Young Min obtained the recording and hurriedly handed it to the police. Unbeknownst to them, Dr. Do Gyun had seen everything through the surveillance. When they went to confront him, he had vanished. Puzzled by his disappearance and how he knew of their plans, Young Min suddenly realized something and found a camera hidden in his car, which Dr. Do Gyun saw. Furious, Young Min smashed the camera. To find Dr. Do Gyun, Young Min returned to the head nurse's home, pulling out Ji-hyun's possessed phone, certain it contained vital evidence. He decided to hand it to the police the next day, believing they would unlock it and find clues. The head nurse panicked and finally showed her true intentions, vowing that she would not let Young Min touch Dr. Do Gyun. Young Min didn't beat around the bush, stating that she was just a puppet of Dr. Do Gyun, a mere tool filled with his murderous desires. The head nurse laughed it off because Young Min didn't understand the depth of Dr. Do Gyun's feelings for her, which had long surpassed familial ties. After Young Min left, the head nurse drove off in a panic, clearly aiming to inform Dr. Do Gyun. Young Min and Ji-hyun quickly followed, and both cars ended up at an abandoned warehouse. The head nurse urged Dr. Do Gyun to flee because his phone, containing incriminating videos, was about to be handed over to the police by Young Min. Unperturbed, Dr. Do Gyun asked the head nurse to retrieve a USB drive holding the original files. Although worried, the head nurse complied and left. To prevent Dr. Do Gyun from escaping, Young Min burst in. Upon seeing his adversary, Dr. Do Gyun swung a metal rod at him. Without a weapon, Young Min was at a disadvantage and was knocked to the ground. Taking the opportunity, Dr. Do Gyun grabbed the phone. In the struggle, Young Min accidentally knocked the battery out. Ji-hyun vanished on the spot. Trying to unlock the phone, Young Min found himself in another predicament, and after a beating, the phone was taken again by Dr. Do Gyun. As he turned on the phone, a strange current surged through him, revealing Ji-hyun. Knowing Young Min's affection for Ji-hyun, Dr. Do-gyu-jin placed the phone over a stove. Young Min panicked, knowing his lover's life was in another's hands. He knelt down, apologizing profusely. Dr. Do-gyu-jin delighted in seeing Young Min's pain. After taunting him, he threw the phone into the furnace. As the phone exploded, Ji-hyun's disappearance seemed imminent until the police arrived and arrested him. Seeing Young Min crying on the ground, the police were baffled. At the hospital, nurses mentioned Young Min only had superficial injuries. Thinking he was just shocked, an officer comforted him. As he was leaving, Young Min stopped him, revealing that his daughter's spirit had always been by his side, though Ji-hyun had kept him from telling her father. Blaming himself, Young Min promised to protect Ji-hyun, but failed. The officer, unmoved, took Young Min to a secret hospital where Ji-hyun lay alive, her death faked by Detective Kang to protect her. Overjoyed, Young Min cared for her until she woke up and grabbed his hand. Meanwhile, the police interrogated Dr. Do-gyu-jin, who staunchly denied everything, until the head nurse arrived at the station, confessing to being the serial killer at Decent Hospital. She revealed a phone used for the crimes and other evidence, insisting Dr. Do-gyu-jin was innocent. With no evidence against him, the police released Dr. Do-gyu-jin. The final plan between him and the head nurse was evident. Later, the head nurse was found in her cell, having committed suicide, leaving a note confessing to being a serial killer, ready to face eternal damnation. The news left the police frustrated by the lack of conclusive evidence. That day, a nurse informed Dr. Do-gyu-jin that a woman, previously declared dead, was alive and well in their hospital. Confused yet determined, Dr. Do-gyu-jin decided to kill her again. He took the potion from the drawer, sat in front of the hospital bed, and cheerfully said that he was happy to bring her to spare again. Just as he was about to inject her, Ji-hyun suddenly stopped him. Young Min ran out from behind to stop him. It was then that Dr. Do-gyu-jin realized he had fallen into a trap. He kicked Young Min away, picked up a vase to smash at Ji-hyun, but luckily, Young Min blocked it just in time. Dr. Do-gyu-jin quickly took the chance to flee. By then, the police had surrounded the area. Seeing this, he took Jo-ri hostage and brought her to the garage. He stopped a car, threw Jo-ri onto the driver, and drove away. After confirming Jo-ri was unharmed, Young Min quickly followed, with the police close behind. However, they had to stop at an intersection due to heavy traffic. Fortunately, Young Min kept up and immediately updated the police on their location, giving them a window to act. They set up a roadblock ahead. With no way out, Dr. Do-gyu-jin was about to be shot by the police when Young Min stepped in front of him. Dr. Do-gyu-jin slammed on the brakes and crashed into the roadblock. The police approached to check the situation. Just as they opened the car door, Dr. Do-gyu-jin pulled a syringe on them, but Young Min rushed out to stop him, determined not to let this villain die so easily. If he has to die, he must first pay for his crimes, he declared. The murderer was finally arrested. In the hospital, after treating his wounds, Ji-hyun and Young Min approached Dr. Do-gyu-jin, who was utterly confused and asked if she was a human or a ghost. Even now, Dr. Do-gyu-jin was still threatening to kill them both, vowing revenge even in death. It seems his scope of knowledge had broadened, but he was mistaken in thinking he would die. Instead, he would spend centuries in prison atoning for his sins. 2 days earlier, Ji-hyun had woken up in the hospital bed, remembering everything that happened when she was a spirit. Now that the head nurse had taken Dr. Do-gyu-jin's place in confessing, they couldn't let him get away with his crimes, so they devised this plan, which fortunately was successfully completed. In prison, the ghostly Dr. Do-gyu-jin was haunted by the vicious desperados still roaming the jail as evil spirits. From now on, it would be hard for Dr. Do-gyu-jin to have a peaceful sleep. The next day, Ji-hyun returned to her duties as a police officer. The police chief didn't rush to assign her tasks but allowed her a day to rest. Delighted, planned to take her daughter out for a big meal, but Ji-hyun mentioned she had a date, to meet the spirit of her deceased mother. Young Min took Ji-hyun to Hwa Gongja's house, where Hwa Gongja channeled the spirit who said she had been unable to leave because she was keeping a promise made before her death to take her son to eat barbecue. So her spirit waited at the barbecue restaurant. Young Min rushed there and indeed found his mother's spirit, who had been waiting a long time. Surprised that her son could see her, she was not upset about the wait. Trying to wipe away her son's tears but unable to touch him, she could only watch him with a heart full of sorrow. Then Ji-hyun came over, no longer able to see spirits. Young Min relayed that his mother was right there. Ji-hyun finally broke down and apologized to Young Min's mother. If not for her, Young Min's mother would not have met with an accident and could have lived happily with Young Min and his grandmother. The woman didn't blame her and told her not to feel guilty because it wasn't her fault. After realizing this, the mother asked Young Min how he came to be with Ji-hyun. In the restaurant, Young Min explained recent events to his mother, and Ji-hyun also expressed her feelings. The mother's biggest concern was always Young Min. Today, Ji-hyun's words finally set her mind at ease. Coming to eat barbecue was a promise between mother and son. She had always said she would bring Young Min here, but it was too expensive, so she kept delaying. Her mother felt very guilty, so she kept waiting there. Now, seeing Young Min eating so deliciously, she was truly happy. With her wish fulfilled, it was time for her to ascend to heaven. In the end, Mom told Young Min, "You are my pride, and the reason I lived. I am happy because of you." She had no regrets left. After saying this, her soul disappeared on the spot. That day, Young Min introduced his grandmother to his wife. For some reason, his grandmother took an immediate liking to her, as if she had always been by her side. In the final chapter, Young Min began assisting Ji-hyun with her cases because he could see ghosts. He also started running a ghost taxi service on the side.